Thank you very much, Janet. Ladies and gentlemen, friends in the pursuit of peace, it is a profound honor to stand before you today to deliver the Desmond Tutu International Peace Lecture, an occasion that calls not merely for remembrance, but for moral reckoning. We gather in the shadow of deepening global polarization amid conflicts that fracture communities and ideologies that harden hearts. And yet in this moment of uncertainty, we invoke the name of a man whose life was a luminous testament to the power of moral courage, prophetic witness, and radical compassion. Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The Desmond Tutu International Peace Lecture began in 2011, and the first 15 lectures have been delivered by a number of distinguished global figures, including Kofi Annan, the Dalai Lama, Mary Robinson, Graça Machel, President Cyril Ramaphosa. It's truly a humbling honor to follow in their illustrious footsteps and to stand at the same podium before you today. Tutu's legacy is often framed by his role in dismantling apartheid, a struggle that earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. But even though we've seen much of that just now in videos and animations, to confine him to that chapter alone is to miss the full breadth of his moral imagination. His fight was never only against racial injustice in South Africa. It was against every system that denied the dignity of the human person. He stood unflinchingly for women's equality, for the rights of LGBTQIA+ people, for the protection of our planet, for the oppressed in Palestine, and for the poor and marginalized across the globe. His was not a selective conscience. It was a universal one. You can change the world, he said. And he was universal in his call. He once declared, and we heard it today, I will not worship a homophobic God. And in that single sentence, he shattered centuries of theological complacency. He reminded us that faith, if it is to be worthy of the divine, must be expansive enough to embrace all of humanity, that it must be a force for liberation, not exclusion, that it must speak truth to power. We've heard that phrase a lot today, even when power wears the robes of religious authority. Indeed, Tutu was often ahead of the institutional church. For 8 years, he campaigned tirelessly for the ordination of women as priests in the Anglican Church of Southern Africa. He did not wait for consensus, he led with conviction. And when he titled one of his books, God is Not a Christian, it was not a provocation, it was a plea to recognize that the divine cannot be confined by doctrine, denomination, or dogma, that God belongs to us all, and that our humanity is bound together in ways that transcend creed. At the heart of Tutu's philosophy, of course, was the African principle of Ubuntu. I am because you are. It is a concept that defies the atomization of modern life. It insists that our destinies are intertwined, that our flourishing depends on the flourishing of others. In a world increasingly defined by borders, physical, ideological, and emotional, Ubuntu is a radical act of resistance. Tutu's values were not abstract ideals, they were lived convictions. He embodied forgiveness, not as a passive gesture, but as a fierce commitment to healing. He championed truth, not as a weapon, but as a balm. He practiced justice, not as retribution, but as restoration. And he believed with every fiber of his being in the inherent dignity of every human soul. These values remain urgently relevant today. In an age of algorithmic outrage and tribal politics, we need moral courage that refuses to be silenced. In a time of ecological collapse, we need to preserve our planet with a compassion that extends to future generations. In a moment of religious strife and xenophobic conflict, we need faith that unites rather than divides. Desmond Tutu did not merely speak these truths, he lived them. And in doing so, he left us not just a legacy, which is in the name of your foundation, Janet, but a challenge to reimagine coexistence, to build peace not on the absence of conflict, but on the presence of justice, to see in every stranger a reflection of ourselves. Let us begin today's lecture then, not with nostalgia, but with resolve. The resolve to carry forward the torch that Tutu lit, not as passive admirers, but as active inheritors of his moral vision. The resolve to be a ripple in that tidal wave of change he asked for. I'm a member of parliament from the constituency of Thiruvananthapuram, which is the capital of the southwestern state of Kerala in India. And I found when I arrived here an odd connection, not so odd, but rather pleasant connection between Thiruvananthapuram and the subject of this lecture. Because I heard from Professor Dr. Binu Luke, somebody who's been working for 30 years in Desmond Tutu's birthplace town of Klerksdorp, that he's the project lead of the Northwest University's new Desmond Tutu School of Medicine, which is going to be established in 2028 in Northwest University in Klerksdorp. In telling me this, Professor Dr. Luke also mentioned not just that he was from my constituency, but that he was an Anglican and a worshipper at the Christ Church in my constituency. And that struck me as interesting because if Archbishop Tutu taught us anything, it is that religion can be both balm and blade. Across history and across continents, faith has been invoked to heal and to harm. It has inspired movements of liberation and justified systems of oppression, including the one in this country. It has built sanctuaries of refuge, and it has built walls of exclusion. Today, as societies wrestle with questions of identity, belonging, and belief, religion remains a potent force. But too often it is weaponized, used to draw boundaries rather than build bridges. We see it in the rhetoric of nationalism cloaked in religious garb, in the persecution of minorities, or the defenestration of immigrants in the name of purity, in the silencing of dissent as heresy, in the conflation of divine will with political power. And yet Desmond Tutu's theology offered a counter-narrative. He believed that faith at its deepest is not about dogma, it is about dignity. Not about orthodoxy, it is about empathy. Not about exclusion, it is about embrace. Not is it about prejudice, but, as he shared along the Dalai Lama, faith is about joy. He understood that peace is not merely the absence of war or conflict, it is the presence of justice, the restoration of relationships, the recognition of our shared humanity. And to build such peace requires more than policy, it requires moral imagination. What is moral imagination? It's the ability to see the world not only as it is, but as it could be. It is the courage to envision reconciliation where others see only revenge. It is the audacity to believe that enemies can become neighbors, that strangers can become kin. It is the capacity not just to sympathize, but to empathize, to see ourselves in the plight of others. In our fractured world, this moral imagination is in short supply. We are trained to fear difference, to retreat into echo chambers, to flatten complexity into caricature. But Tutu's life reminds us that empathy is not weakness, it is strength. That solidarity is not surrender, it is salvation. What if I told you that division is the most expensive tax we pay, not levied by governments, but by the erosion of trust? When confidence breaks down between neighbors, businesses, and institutions, the consequences ripple far beyond politics. Economies stall, investment retreats, and ordinary citizens bear the cost, not in rupees or dollars, or not just, but in opportunity, in dignity, in hope. We live in an age where headlines reward outrage and punish menace, where nuance is discarded as irrelevant, where belief, faith, and tradition, once sources of solace and solidarity, are too often weaponized to divide rather than to heal. We must confront this reality head-on, because true prosperity does not come from slogans or spin. It comes from moral courage. And when leaders choose short-term gain over the common good, the result is a poverty that runs deeper than economics, a poverty of spirit, a poverty of ethics, a poverty of shared purpose. How then can societies rediscover their moral imagination? First, by reclaiming the sacredness of the other. Tutu often said, if you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies. That was not naivete, it was prophetic realism. It was a recognition that peace cannot be built on selective compassion, that the humanity of the other is not negotiable. Second, by cultivating spaces of encounter. Peace is not forged in isolation. It is born in relationships, in shared meals, shared stories, shared struggles, in interfaith dialogue that moves beyond tolerance to transformation, in civic spaces where disagreement is not a threat, but a gift. We live in a world where political rivals distrust and demonize each other, see each other as enemies and not just adversaries. Tutu taught us to look for the humanity on the other side, and to find a space to meet it. Third, as we've heard so often today, by telling the truth. Tutu's leadership of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country was grounded in the belief that healing requires honesty, that we must name the wounds before we can bind them and heal them, that silence is complicity and denial is violence. And fourth and finally, by embracing vulnerability. Moral imagination is not built on certitudes. It is built on humility, not certainty, on the willingness to be changed by what we hear, on the courage to admit when we are wrong, on the grace to forgive and to be forgiven. In this moment of global reckoning, we must ask, what kind of faith will we practice? What kind of peace will we pursue? What kind of humanity will we honor? Let us choose the path that Tutu walked on, the path of radical empathy, of courageous truth-telling, of unflinching hope. Let us imagine peace not as a distant ideal, but as a daily discipline. And let us build it together. If we are to reimagine coexistence in our time, we must begin with a simple but radical proposition that the world's faith traditions at their deepest are not in competition. They are in conversation. Archbishop Desmond Tutu understood this profoundly. Though rooted, of course, in Christian theology, which he'd studied, his moral compass was not confined to one creed or one holy book. He saw in every faith, In every faith tradition, a reservoir of wisdom, a call to compassion, a summons to justice. He believed that the spiritual and ethical foundations of religion could be harnessed, not to divide humanity, but to unite it. That was why it was so fitting that the first Desmond Tutu lecture was delivered by the Dalai Lama. And indeed, across the world's religions, we find common ground. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, echoes in the teachings of Jesus, the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, the ethics of Confucius, the dharma of the Buddha, the laws of Moses, and the Upanishadic version of the vision of the self in all human beings, on all beings, human and animal alike. These are not marginal teachings. They are central to their faith traditions. They are sacred. I am a Hindu, and I learned from the great preacher Swami Vivekananda, who took Hinduism to the world in the late 19th century, that Hinduism stands for both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, he spoke, but we accept all religions as true. This was a profound insight, and that too in the late Victorian era. I, after all, went to school in India, studied history, and learned that tolerance is supposed to be a virtue, that the tolerant king is a good king because he allows you to believe things he doesn't believe. But in fact, what Vivekananda was telling us is that tolerance is ultimately a patronizing idea. It is saying that I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That is not enough. And what Vivekananda taught us Hindus is that we must replace tolerance with acceptance. That is, we must say, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And in that, we have the great recipe for human and interreligious coexistence. The Swami often recited an ancient hymn, the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, to the effect that as different streams originating in different places all flow in different ways, some down hills, some through valleys, but end up at the same sea, so do all paths lead to the same divinity. He repeatedly asserted the wisdom of the Hindu belief that truth is one, even if the sages call it by different names. His vision was summarized in the credo, Sarva Dharma Sambhava, all religions are equal. Yet too often religion is reduced to boundary making, to identity politics, to tribalism. We forget that the word religion itself comes from religare, to bind together, not to bind in chains, but in kinship. What would it mean then to reclaim religion not as a barrier that excludes non-believers, but as a bridge that unites those of all faiths and none? It would mean recognizing that every faith tradition carries within it a vision of peace, not merely as the absence of violence, but as the presence of dharma, the force that maintains righteousness in the world, ensuring a universal moral order. It would mean lifting up to the prophets and sages who call for justice, even when it was inconvenient. It would mean listening not only to the scriptures, but to the silences between them, the places where humility dwells. It would mean building interfaith coalitions, not just for dialogue, but for action. Action for climate justice. I was just speaking to Bishop Jeff about his efforts in that area. Action for refugee protection, the field in which I began my career at the UN almost 4.5 decades ago. Action for gender equality. Action for the dignity of the poor. It would mean seeing the church, the temple, the synagogue, the mosque, not as rival fortresses, but as neighboring wells from which humanity can draw its moral sustenance. Tutu often spoke of the rainbow people of God, as Janet reminded us, a vision not of uniformity, but of unity in diversity. He believed that difference was not a threat, but a gift. that the divine is too vast to be captured by any one faith tradition, that we must approach each other not with fear or suspicion, but with reverence. Similarly, Hinduism has taught me that truth is plural, that there is no one correct answer to the big questions of creation or of the meaning of life. The greatest truth to the Hindu is that which accepts the existence of other truths. This is not to deny the real tensions between religions. History is replete with conflict. As the late UN Secretary General, my former boss and my predecessor on this lecture podium, Kofi Annan, put it memorably, the problem is never with the faith, but with the faithful. For all religions preach the ideas, the values, the virtues of peace and of loving others. And yet, we should never forget that the history of faith is not only replete with conflict, but also replete with cooperation, with shared rituals, shared feasts, shared festivals. It's also replete with moments when people of different faiths stood together against tyranny, against apartheid, as we saw the rainbow people against apartheid, against genocide, or in India, against partition. But that is history, some will say. So must it just be relegated to the past? In our time, we must cultivate what Tutu embodied, a theology of embrace, a spirituality of solidarity, a faith that does not ask, who is my neighbor, but declares, everyone is my neighbor. Let us then draw from the deep wells of our traditions, not to quench only our own thirst, but to offer water to others. Let us build bridges of peace, not on the shaky foundations of tolerance, but on the solid ground of acceptance of each other, of shared moral purpose. And let us remember, as Tutu did, that the divine is not a possession, it is a presence that calls us again and again to love. Yet even as we seek and find and express that love, we must acknowledge that to stand for peace in our time is to walk a tightrope across a landscape of contradictions. We live in a world where the language of human rights is often spoken most fluently by those who violate them, where the rhetoric of peace is deployed to justify war, where the enduring of one set of horrors is cited to justify the infliction of another set of horrors, where the victims of violence are judged by their geography, their religion, their color, their strategic value, and where geopolitical interests routinely distort justice and truth. Archbishop Tutu refused to play that game. He stood for peace not selectively, but consistently. He spoke out against racial discrimination in South Africa and against the occupation of large parts of Palestine. He condemned violence, whether it came from the state or from the street. He challenged injustice, whether it wore the mask of ideology or the robe of religion. He did not ask whether a cause was popular. He asked only whether it was just. This moral consistency is rare. It is difficult. It is uncomfortable. It is costly. But it is essential. Because peace cannot be built on double standards. It cannot be sustained by silence. It cannot be negotiated in rooms where the powerful speak and the powerless are merely spoken about. Where some are actors on the global stage, but the others are mere extras, shuffled about like pawns to do the other's bidding. To stand for peace today means asking the hard questions. Why do some lives seem to matter more than others? Why are some invasions condemned and others ignored? Why are the rights of the rich worth so much more than the dreams of the poor? Why are some refugees welcomed and others turned away? Why are some truths amplified and others buried? Oh, these are not, as some will allege, political questions. They are moral ones, and they demand a moral response. Tutu understood that neutrality in the face of injustice is not virtue, it is complicity. He reminded us that silence is not peace, it is the absence of accountability. That reconciliation without truth is not healing, it is erasure. In a world of shifting alliances and strategic interests, we must reclaim the language of peace from the calculus of power. We must insist that justice is not a bargaining chip, that human dignity is not negotiable, that truth is not relative to the interests of the strong. This requires courage. The courage to speak when it is inconvenient, to stand with the marginalized when it is unpopular, to challenge our own governments, our own institutions, our own communities, our own political parties, and sometimes even our own religious leaders, as Desmond Tutu did. But it also requires humility. The humility to listen to those whose pain we have ignored, to learn from those whose histories we have erased, to recognize that our moral vision is always partial, always in need of expansion. And it requires solidarity, not as a sentiment, let alone a slogan, but as a strategy, as a commitment to build alliances across borders, across faiths, across struggles, as a refusal to let the powerful define whose suffering counts. This is why we need to recommit ourselves to the United Nations. As someone who served the UN for nearly 3 decades, from 1978 to 2007, I witnessed firsthand its evolution from a Cold War battleground to a post-Cold War laboratory of global cooperation. I was part of its efforts to protect refugees and its struggles to build peace. I saw the UN falter in Rwanda and Srebrenica, and rise to the occasion in Timor-Leste, East Timor, and Namibia. I saw it struggle with bureaucracy and politics, yet persist in its mission to feed the hungry, shelter the displaced, and give voice to the voiceless. Today, when people decry its failures over Gaza and Ukraine, I acknowledge again that the UN is not perfect, nor was it ever meant to be, and yet it remains indispensable. As someone who spent much of his adult life in its service, I remain convinced that the UN matters. It matters to the refugees seeking shelter, to the peacekeeper standing guard, to the diplomat negotiating a fragile truce. It matters to all of us who believe that cooperation is not weakness, that justice is not luxury. The United Nations remains an indispensable symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. As Dag Hammarskjöld so memorably said, it was meant not to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. In the aftermath of its 80th anniversary last month, its challenge is to become more representative, more responsive, and resilient in a world that needs principled global cooperation more than ever. To abandon it would be to abandon the very idea of our common humanity. Our own survival, and that of the only universal world organization we have, the United Nations, depends not on nostalgia, but on renewal. And that renewal begins with the recognition that in an interconnected world, no nation is truly sovereign unless all are. It is time for that reimagination, that moral reimagination of the United Nations. I had the great honor of meeting Desmond Tutu at the United Nations, as well as outside it, in the cold snows of Davos. Tutu's life was a masterclass in moral consistency, as I've said. He did not flinch, he did not equivocate, he did not tailor his conscience to the times. Let us honor him, not just by quoting his words, not even by echoing his ideas, but by living his witness. Let us stand for peace, not as a slogan, but as a standard. Let us speak truth, not as a weapon, but as a light. And let us remember the arc of history does not bend on its own. It bends when we pull it, with courage, with clarity, and with love. As I draw my reflections to a close, let me return to the crucible in which Desmond Tutu's moral vision was most severely tested, the aftermath of apartheid. In the wake of unspeakable violence and systemic dehumanization, South Africa stood at a crossroads. The world expected vengeance. Many demanded it. Some fled in anticipation of it. But Tutu, entrusted with chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, offered something far more radical. Not amnesia, not impunity, but a path through truth to justice, and through justice to healing. He understood that forgiveness is not the opposite of justice, it is its companion. That truth-telling is not a substitute for accountability, it is its foundation. That reconciliation is not a shortcut around pain, it's a journey through pain. In the TRC, victims were invited to speak their truth, perpetrators were required to confess theirs. The goal was not to erase the past, but to confront it. Not to forget, but to remember rightly. Not to punish for punishment's sake, but to restore the moral order that had been shattered. This model has inspired post-conflict societies around the world, from Rwanda to Colombia, from Northern Ireland to Sierra Leone. And yet the work of reconciliation everywhere remains unfinished. In many places, the wounds of war are still raw. The ghosts of colonialism still haunt its survivors and their descendants. The call for moral atonement falls on deaf ears in the countries that benefited from colonialism. The machinery of impunity still grinds on in too many places. And injustice, oppression, subjugation, genocide, or terrorism all stalk too many human beings in too many places. So what does Tutu's vision demand of us now? It demands that we reject the false choice between peace and justice, that we insist on both, that we recognize that healing requires truth and that truth requires courage. It demands that we listen to the silenced, that we center the stories of survivors, that we listen to the victims of terror and not those who clamor their cause in its name, that we dismantle the systems, legal, economic, ideological, that perpetuate inequality and exclusion, that we challenge the structures that exclude and clamor to change them into places of inclusion. And surely, perhaps above all, it demands that we reclaim hope, not as starry-eyed optimism, but as defiant realism, as a stubborn belief that the world can be remade, that it is wrong and unjust, need not remain so in perpetuity, that the arc of history can still bend, and that it always bends in the long run towards dharma. In a world riven by war and terrorism, by climate collapse and mass displacement, by rising authoritarianism, hostility and xenophobia, it is easy to despair. But despair is a luxury we cannot afford. As Tutu reminded us, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. So let us ask, how do we cultivate a global ethic that affirms the dignity, equality, and sacredness of every person? We begin by teaching our children that no one is born to hate, that every human being carries within them the image of the divine, that our differences are not threats, that they are threads in the tapestry of our shared humanity. We continue by building institutions that reflect this ethic, schools that teach empathy, courts that uphold justice, economies that serve the common good, media that amplify truth over fear. And we persevere by embodying this ethic in our daily lives, in how we speak, in how we listen, in how we broaden, not harden our hearts towards those with whom we disagree, in how we show up for one another, not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet, unseen acts of solidarity that stitch the world back together. Let me end then not with a lament, but with a call to action. Let us be the generations that refuse to be divided by fear or hatred. Let us be the citizens who speak truth, even when it trembles in our throats. Let us be the believers of every faith and none who choose love over hatred, justice over vengeance, courage over comfort, principle over the uneasy compromises of pragmatism. Let us be the builders of bridges, the architects of inclusiveness, the healers of wounds, the promoters of hope. Let us be the ones to keep the lamps lit in the gathering gloom, the ones who hold aloft the flickering flames of hope and faith, even in the midst of an intensifying darkness. For the world does not need more cynics. It needs more Tutus, or at least more Tutu-like souls, fierce in their compassion, joyful in their resistance, relentless in their belief that peace is possible, optimistic in their determination to do their part to bring it about, to be that ripple in that tidal wave of change. So rise up, friends, hold hands, reach across, and speak out. Let us begin anew in the realization that we are bound together, that I am because you are. And together we can still shape a world worthy of our children's dreams. Before you all today, I salute the blessed memory of Desmond Tutu. Thank you all very much.